The chandeliers glittered above her like frozen constellations, each crystal burning with the cold scrutiny of 100 watching eyes. Lady Eleanor Ashford stood at the edge of the ballroom, hands clasped tightly at her waist, posture painstakingly perfect as her governess had once taught her. But perfection was useless armor tonight. Whispers slithered between brocade gowns and starched collars, gathering in corners like smoke. Every murmur carried her name, sometimes softened with pity, sometimes sharpened with delight, yet always citing the same scandal. The Ashfords were ruined, and their daughter had been bartered to a man the ton called a monster. She tried not to flinch as a pair of young debutantes drifted closer, their fans fluttering like pale moths. "Poor thing," one whispered, far too loudly. "Imagine being offered to him." The second girl, bolder, leaned toward her companion. "They say he dismissed 3 prospective brides with a single glance. And now he settles for this one, because desperation wears a pretty disguise." Eleanor kept her chin high, though the words struck her with the force of a slap. She wanted to disappear into the floor, into the shadows, into anything that was not this spectacle of humiliation disguised as celebration. At the far end of the hall stood the Duke of Ravenswood, her betrothed, though he had not spoken a single word to her since their engagement was announced. He was tall, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, and profoundly still, as though carved from something far heavier than marble. A thin scar traveled from the edge of his left brow down to the hollow of his cheek, disappearing beneath his jawline like a river swallowed by earth. No one dared approach him. The space around him seemed colder, the air sharper, as if even the music softened itself in his presence. People averted their eyes quickly, as though staring too long might earn his wrath. Eleanor had seen fear many times in her short life, fear of debt collectors, of social disgrace, of her father's trembling hands as he signed a marriage contract, but she had never seen fear made flesh as it was in the figure of Alastair Ravenswood. He looked like a man accustomed to solitude, a man who had grown intimate with shadows. It was said he had sent his previous fiancée away in tears, had banished a servant for making noise in the corridors, had once broken a man's nose without rising from his chair. Yet beneath the cold legend, she sensed something else, something unspoken, unreadable, perhaps even wounded. She inhaled deeply, summoning her courage, and stepped forward. The distance between them felt like an entire lifetime. Her pale pink gown brushed against polished floors that reflected the crystal lights above, making her appear almost ghost-like. As she approached him, conversation in the room dimmed to a hush. Every gaze followed her. She wondered if anyone realized she was trying not to tremble. Her gloves were damp inside her palms, and the air seemed to thicken with each measured step. When she reached him, she paused, waiting for the moment he would turn toward her. He did not. His gaze remained fixed ahead, unreadable, as though she were no more significant than a breeze passing by. She offered a small curtsy, her voice barely rising above the music. "Your Grace," she said, "I wish to thank you for hosting this evening." No response. His eyes did not flicker, not even in acknowledgement. It was as if her words dissolved on contact. Heat pricked behind her eyes, but she swallowed it, swallowing too the pride she had so carefully preserved. Nearby guests exchanged triumphant glances, confirmation of their expectations. "He cannot bear to look at her," someone whispered. "Can you blame him?" another responded. A third, older lady murmured, "She is as unfortunate as her father. A ruined family produces a ruined girl." Eleanor felt their words settle onto her shoulders like stones. She stepped back quietly, intending to retreat before her composure shattered. But just as she turned, she caught a flicker of movement from him. The Duke's eyes, gray with a hint of slate, shifted toward her, not fully, merely a fraction. It was enough for her breath to catch. In that half-glance, she saw neither disdain nor coldness. She saw something closer to hesitation, curiosity, perhaps even regret. It was gone in an instant, like a candle starved of air, yet it lingered in her chest like a fragile spark. The announcement of their impending marriage followed moments later, delivered by Lady Montfort with ostentatious delight, as though she were presenting a tragedy wrapped in satin. The guests applauded politely, but their applause was hollow, brittle. Eleanor felt detached from her body, as though she watched herself from a great height, her polite smile, her bowed head, her hands clasped with obedient grace. She wondered how long she could endure such scrutiny before she finally cracked. As the evening drew on, she retreated to a balcony overlooking the courtyard, watching snowflakes drift through the night air. Their delicate descent seemed almost mocking. Inside, laughter and gossip intertwined like poisonous vines. Out here, the silence was a small mercy. She closed her eyes, wishing she could vanish into the quiet. She did not want this life. She did not want to belong to a man who could not bring himself to look at her. Yet she had no other path. Her family's survival rested on her shoulders. The world she had known was gone, replaced by a future she feared would crush her. She sensed him before she heard him. The faint shift of fabric, the slow, deliberate step onto the balcony. Her breath stilled. He stood a few paces behind her, the cold air swirling around them. For a moment, neither spoke. She wondered if he meant to offer some kindness, some explanation. She dared not hope for warmth. She simply longed for acknowledgement. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and unexpectedly gentle. "Lady Eleanor," he said, "you should not stand out in the cold." She turned toward him slowly, startled by the civility in his tone. His gaze met hers directly, unguarded for the first time that night. And in that brief, fragile moment, she saw something that unsettled her more than all the rumors combined. He looked afraid. Eleanor entered Ravenswood Manor with the apprehension of one stepping into a cathedral carved from storms. The corridors whispered with old tapestries and colder rumors, each shadow carrying a story about the man she had married only hours before. Her footsteps echoed softly, too softly, as though the house itself were unwilling to acknowledge her presence. A maid guided her to her chamber with a bow so swift it felt like a dismissal. Eleanor tried not to let the slight pierce her already fragile composure, though uncertainty clung to her like damp lace. The room awaiting her was unexpectedly beautiful, high-ceilinged, warm, filled with lamplight that glowed against carved oak. Fresh linens graced the bed, embroidered with blue lilies. She paused, fingertips grazing the fabric, and wondered who had chosen them. A fire crackled quietly in the hearth, giving the impression of welcome, though she could not decide if the gesture belonged to the Duke or his meticulous staff. She removed her gloves with trembling hands, whispering to herself that a gentle room did not guarantee a gentle marriage. The uncertainty felt like an invisible hand pressing upon her collarbones. On the small dressing table rested a velvet box she was certain had not been there earlier. Its deep crimson hue stood out against the polished wood like a drop of spilled wine. Her heart began to thud painfully as she approached it. For a moment she hesitated, afraid it might contain something cruelly symbolic, a reminder of her place or her insignificance. Yet curiosity guided her fingers. She lifted the lid to discover a delicate hairpin carved of pale ivory, shaped into two intertwined lilies. It was exquisite, far too fine for someone who had entered this house with nothing but her father's debts trailing behind her like chains. A small folded note lay beside it, penned in a hand both elegant and severe. "No one will harm you under my roof. Nothing more." No flourishes, no signature, yet she felt the weight of the Duke's presence in every stroke of the ink. The man who had barely looked at her, who stood apart from the world as though touch itself wounded him, had left this. For her. She pressed the hairpin to her chest, stunned by the unexpected tenderness it implied. It contradicted everything the Tun had whispered about him. It contradicted everything she had feared. But outside the walls of the manor, gossip was already sharpening its claws. By morning, London's drawing rooms buzzed with scandal. Some claimed the monster Duke had locked his wife in a gilded chamber, others that he had refused to share the bridal table with her. A few insisted he had gifted her jewels worth a fortune to buy her silence. Eleanor learned of these tales as the house staff moved uneasily around her, unwilling to meet her gaze. She sensed their assumptions, their quiet speculations about her purpose here. In that fragile dawn, she realized she was battling not only her husband's distance but an entire society eager for her failure. Later that afternoon, Lady Harrow invited her to a small luncheon, a gesture Eleanor interpreted as an olive branch or a trap, though she accepted. The gathering was held in a sunroom fragrant with winter roses. Its beauty did little to soften the barbed smiles awaiting her. The ladies spoke sweetly, but their sweetness tasted of iron. When Eleanor's modest gown drew curious glances, she braced herself. Lady Harrow, with eyes bright as polished steel, observed. "My dear, is this truly all your husband permits you to wear? A simple muslin? One would think a duchess might aspire to elegance." Eleanor tried to answer with dignity. "The Duke grants me the freedom to choose what I find comfortable." But her voice wavered slightly, betraying more vulnerability than she intended. Murmurs followed, thinly veiled amusement rippling through the room. She felt the sting of humiliation burrow deeper than Lady Harrow's words. Her throat tightened. Her heart hammered. She wondered how many more such afternoons she could endure without breaking. Then the room fell abruptly silent. Alastair Ravenswood stood in the doorway, silent and immovable as a winter storm. He had not been invited. She had not expected him. Yet here he was, dark coat dusted with snow, presence commanding enough to still every fan and breath. Lady Harrow froze, her composure cracking. Eleanor felt her pulse explode with a mixture of dread and relief. She feared what he might say. She feared more what he might not. His gaze swept the room once, landing on Eleanor before turning to Lady Harrow. "My wife," he said, voice low and precise, "requires no adornment to eclipse anyone present." A beat of shocked stillness. Then he added, with the quiet brutality of a polished blade, "But cruelty does often beg for decoration." The words struck like lightning. Lady Harrow paled. No one breathed. Eleanor stared at him, her chest tightening at the sharp, unexpected defense. Without shifting his gaze, he extended his arm toward Eleanor. The gesture was formal, yet something beneath it pulsed with unspoken intent. She hesitated, every instinct urging her to remain invisible, unnoticed, but his quiet command seemed to draw her. She placed her trembling fingers lightly upon his sleeve. He did not recoil. Instead, his posture seemed to soften by the smallest, nearly imperceptible degree. As he guided her from the room, murmurs erupted behind them. Eleanor did not dare look back. Her heart beat so fiercely she feared he could hear it. The corridor outside was dim and cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating brightness within. When they reached the foot of the grand staircase, he released her hand gently, as though it were made of porcelain. She wanted to thank him, but words felt too fragile. Before she could speak, he said quietly, almost reluctantly, "I did not intend for you to face such venom alone." His eyes, usually unreadable, held something she could not yet name. And there, in the quiet hollow between them, she realized this man, this supposed monster, had begun to step toward her in ways she had not expected. He turned then, as though retreating from his own admission. Yet she saw it clearly. The veil between their worlds had shifted, if only by a breath. Snow drifted outside the manor windows like pale, drifting ash as evening unfurled its quiet dominion. Eleanor sat before the low fire in her chamber, hands folded tightly in her lap, wondering how one was meant to breathe after a man's single sentence changed the air in every room one entered. All afternoon her thoughts had circled the same bewildering truth. Alastair Ravenswood had defended her, publicly, decisively, with a ferocity she had never imagined he might possess on her behalf. Yet the memory of his earlier distance still clung to her like a bruise. She could not reconcile the two versions of him, the aloof duke who avoided her gaze, and the resolute figure who silenced a room for her dignity. A soft knock disrupted her thoughts. Before she could answer, the door opened just enough for the butler to clear his throat. "His Grace requests your presence in the conservatory," he announced. "If it pleases you, my lady." She thanked him, though her voice trembled with a mixture of apprehension and reluctant hope. Why would the Duke seek her now? Had she committed some offense by simply existing in a world too eager to judge them both? The conservatory glowed with lamplight when she arrived, its glass walls reflecting gardens swallowed in moonlit frost. Alastair stood near a cluster of winter roses, his back partially turned, hands clasped behind him as though preparing to face a verdict rather than a conversation. The sight of him, tall, severe, almost statuesque, sent a familiar ripple through her. She cleared her throat softly. "You wish to speak with me, Your Grace." He turned at once. The shadows cast by the lamps played upon his features, deepening the scar that traversed his cheek. Yet his gaze, when it met hers, held none of the coldness she had come to expect. Instead, something unguarded flickered there, something raw. Eleanor, he said, quietly, her name sounding almost fragile on his tongue. I owe you an explanation. Perhaps more than one. She stepped nearer, drawn not by duty but by a compulsion she dared not name. You owe me nothing, she murmured, though her heart hammered with questions. But I would listen. He exhaled, a slow, measured breath that suggested he had rehearsed this moment many times and never found the courage to enact it. You must understand, he began. I never intended for this marriage to be forced upon you. She flinched slightly at the word, though he noticed at once. Not forced by me, he clarified softly, but by circumstance, by society, by your father's desperation, by my own reputation, which made a quiet refusal impossible. Her breath caught. So the rumors were true, she whispered. You did not want a wife. He shook his head, expression tightening. No. I did not want another casualty in my proximity. His voice was low, roughened by something that hinted at loneliness more than anger. Every woman who came near me saw only the myth they had crafted, the beast, the brute, the ruthless creature who brought ruin with his temper. They never looked long enough to see the truth. He paused, gaze drifting momentarily to the snow outside. Or perhaps I never allowed them to. Eleanor's pulse stirred with cautious curiosity. And what truth is that? That I am not blind to the pain I cause simply by being who I am. He faced her fully now, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her chest ache. My temper is not what the gossip claims. I do not break furniture or terrorize servants. But he swallowed hard, as though the words resisted him. I carry a darkness, Eleanor, a heaviness, a sorrow I have never learned to master. It makes me difficult to live beside. She studied him, seeing not a monster but a man carved by grief he had never spoken aloud. Darkness, she said softly, is not a crime. He gave a humorless laugh. In society's eyes, it may as well be. He stepped closer, slowly, carefully, as though approaching a frightened bird. She felt warmth radiate from him, steady and grounding. When I first saw you, he continued, voice quieter, I feared you would look at me the way others did, with dread, with revulsion. So I kept my distance. I thought it would protect you. Her breath trembled. Protect me from what? From me, he admitted. From the burden of being bound to a man whispered about in every drawing-room. I thought if I remained cold, at least you would not grow attached. You would not hope. His voice cracked faintly. And hope is the cruelest wound I have ever inflicted. Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a gentle breaking, tender rather than harsh. She reached up, fingers trembling, and touched the ivory hairpin he had gifted her. Then why this? She asked. Why offer kindness in secret and distance in public? He hesitated, expression taut with restrained emotion. Because I wanted you to feel safe, even if I could not yet be the one to provide that safety openly. I wanted you to know that, despite my silence, I saw you. And I admired your strength far more than I ever dared say. Her breath left her in a soft gasp. Admiration was not something she had ever envisioned receiving from him. I am not strong, she whispered. You are, he countered immediately. You walk through rooms filled with cruelty and keep your dignity intact. You face humiliation with your chin raised. You endure my distance and still attempt kindness. He paused, voice thickening. Do you not see how extraordinary that is? The words washed over her like a balm she had long needed. She stepped close enough that the scent of him, cedar, cold air, and some faint metallic whisper, surrounded her. Alistair, she said, testing his name for the first time aloud. His eyes widened, breath hitching ever so slightly. I do not fear you. He stood utterly still, as though her declaration had cut through walls he spent years constructing. You should, he murmured. It would be easier. Then ease is not what I want. A long silence stretched between them, threaded with tension so delicate it threatened to snap. Then he said, barely above a whisper, There is something I must show you. Something that will decide what path lies between us. She felt the shift in his tone, heavier, darker, threaded with foreboding. And when he extended his hand toward the shadowed end of the conservatory, her heart clenched with a mixture of dread and impossible hope, wondering what truth the so-called monster was finally ready to reveal. The evening air hung thick with frost and expectation as Ravenswood Manor prepared to host its winter ball, a spectacle meant to dazzle the ton and, in Eleanor's mind, to humiliate her. Every servant moved with rigid precision, candles flickering against silver candelabras as if the light itself trembled in anticipation. She paused at the base of the grand staircase, gown sweeping the polished floor, and felt the weight of hundreds of eyes already upon her, even before she entered the ballroom. Her fingers grazed the silk at her waist, tracing the embroidery she had once thought impossible for a woman in her precarious position. Midnight blue, as Alistair had insisted, with delicate lilies stitched along the hem. He had chosen it himself. She wondered, not for the first time, how a man capable of silence and distance could also possess such intuition. Her heart fluttered with a mingling of dread and fragile hope as she ascended the steps, the echo of her heels striking the marble like the measured beating of a drum. Guests paused mid-conversation, eyes darting toward her in a mixture of curiosity and scandalized delight. Whispers, as expected, swept through the room. "The Ashford girl dares to appear," one lady hissed, fan fluttering in protest. And with the monster duke at her side. Eleanor forced her chin higher, drawing herself into a posture of quiet dignity. She could not yet claim courage. She could only present the semblance of it. At the doorway, he waited. Alistair Ravenswood, as dark and imposing as the shadows that pooled beneath the vaulted ceiling. When he extended his arm toward her, it was not as a command but as an invitation. She slipped her hand into his with a tremor that belied her outward composure. The room seemed to contract around them, as if the walls themselves leaned forward to witness the unlikely spectacle. The feared duke and the bride whispered to be broken, moving together in deliberate, unspoken defiance. The music began, a soft waltz weaving through the room with delicate elegance. Eleanor's gaze flicked over the assembled guests, noting the subtle stiffening of spines and the narrowing of eyes. Baroness Harrow, who had mocked her modest gown weeks earlier, now looked utterly disarmed. Whispers of disbelief passed like ripples through the crowd. Alistair's hand, warm and unyielding at her waist, reminded her that she did not walk alone, and for the first time she felt a surge of quiet triumph. Not one word had yet been spoken, but their presence together was itself a declaration. When the Baron of Redcombe made a veiled remark about her attire, Eleanor stiffened, ready to retreat behind polite silence. But Alistair's voice cut through the room, low, resonant, and impossible to ignore. "Insult my wife again, and you shall answer to me in whatever manner you deem suitable," he intoned. The hall fell into stunned silence. The Baron faltered mid-sentence, flushing crimson. Eleanor felt the tremor of power beneath her fingers, the gravity of protection offered without fanfare or theatrics. For the first time, she sensed that society's whispers might no longer have dominion over her. The waltz swept them into the center of the polished floor. Eleanor's fingers remained lightly curled around his, her body poised yet supple with tension. The music wound around them, a river of sound that carried away judgment and replaced it with fleeting freedom. His eyes, dark and inscrutable, met hers, and in that gaze she glimpsed a depth she had not dared hope existed. Admiration, respect, and something warmer, something almost tender. It startled her, unbalancing the careful equilibrium she had maintained since arriving in his home. As they moved together, Eleanor felt herself breathing in rhythm with him, heartbeats synchronized despite months of distance and whispered rumors. She realized then that the rumors of cruelty had been shadows over the truth, and that she had been wrong to fear his nature entirely. Yet caution still held her tongue. She had seen glimpses of tenderness before, only to have them retreat into shadow. This was different. She could feel the deliberate steadiness of his presence, the subtle acknowledgment of her strength, and the deliberate absence of judgment. It was a revelation both exhilarating and terrifying. A gentle laugh escaped her lips as the dance continued, soft enough to be carried only to him. "I thought you meant to break me," she whispered, almost afraid of her own audacity. His gaze softened, and a shadow of a smile curved the edge of his lips. "I intended only to shield you," he replied, voice low and deliberate, "even from myself." The confession lingered in the air between them, more intimate than a touch, more binding than any vow. Eleanor's chest tightened with an unfamiliar warmth. For the first time, the legend of the monster seemed hollow, an echo eclipsed by the reality of the man beside her. The music swelled, and the dance reached a point where the ballroom faded around her. Guests became mere silhouettes, murmurs a gentle hum beneath the solid presence of his hand against her back, his fingers brushing hers with a subtle insistence. Eleanor placed her free hand against his chest, feeling the slow, powerful rhythm of a heart that had endured loneliness and scrutiny alike. His eyes darkened, reflecting the flickering lamplight, and for a moment, time seemed suspended between past fears and newfound understanding. She realized that the man who had terrified society now held the only key to her own liberation. As the waltz concluded, Alistair guided her gently toward a shadowed alcove, away from the prying eyes and murmuring tongues. She wanted to speak, to name the sensation of relief, fear, and anticipation coursing through her, but words faltered. He did not speak either, yet the brush of his fingers along hers said what the world could not: protection, patience, and an invitation to trust. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, and she found herself silently willing him to remain, to stay in that fragile space suspended between revelation and retreat. Then, unexpectedly, he released her hand, stepping back with measured distance, as if the touch itself was too volatile to linger. "Do not mistake this," he murmured, gaze holding hers just long enough to ignite longing, "for absence of consequence. What occurs between us is neither whispered nor assumed. You must understand it fully, when the time comes." His words, deliberate and precise, struck deeper than any declaration of public defense. They carried promise, restraint, and a weight she had never imagined. Eleanor swallowed, heart pounding, and nodded, understanding both the warning and the invitation. She felt a shift inside herself, a subtle unspooling of fear and suspicion. Tonight, she had walked through the scrutiny of society and emerged not diminished but validated, protected, and seen. The room itself seemed transformed. No longer a tribunal, no longer a gallery of whispered judgments, but a stage upon which she and the Duke of Ravenswood could exist, briefly, unbroken. As they left the ballroom together, Eleanor could not help but glance up at his profile, pale lamplight tracing the strong line of his jaw, the faint scar etched like a river of past misfortune. And when he offered his arm once more, guiding her down the marble steps into the crisp night air, she took it without hesitation, feeling the first real certainty of protection she had ever known, and the quiet, unspoken promise that the winter ball was only the beginning. The storm arrived without ceremony, rain hammering against the windows of Ravenswood Manor as if the heavens themselves demanded witness. Inside, Eleanor paced the grand drawing-room, hands pressed to her temples, heart thrumming with anxious intensity. Rumors had erupted that morning, letters forged, scandalous whispers claiming her affections remained with another man. The tongue's malice was relentless, and she had spent the day bracing for the inevitable confrontation, yet she had never imagined the cruel precision with which society could strike at a woman's honor. Each word, each glance she imagined, burned like fire against her dignity. She felt cornered, fragile, a candle flickering against a gale. Alistair entered then, silent as the shadows pooling at the corners of the room, his coat damp with the storm outside. He had heard of the rumors, of course, and his expression bore the weight of both anger and careful control. Eleanor looked up at him, a tremor in her chest betraying both fear and hope. "I cannot endure this," she whispered, voice small yet fierce. "They will destroy me." He moved toward her, deliberate, measured, and for the first time she noticed the faint quiver in his own hands, the subtle tension coiling in his shoulders. "No one will harm you, Eleanor," he said quietly, though each word rang with absolute authority. "Not through rumor, not through insult, not through the empty malice of society. If they attempt it, I will stand between you and every dagger they wield." Her throat tightened. The declaration was not theatrical, not public, yet it carried more power than any ceremony or title could. She had spent weeks believing she was entering a marriage to be broken, that her life would be dictated by whispers and fear. And now this man, this so-called monster, promised her safety in a way that transcended the physical. She felt herself trembling, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and longing she had never permitted herself to name. The first knock at the door startled her, followed by the sharp intonation of a butler's voice delivering a message meant to provoke. A group of socialites, eager to embarrass her before the world, demanded an immediate audience, insisting that she explain herself publicly. Eleanor's breath caught, and her hands rose instinctively. The letters, the whispers, the entire ton's expectations, pressed upon her like suffocating snow. She looked at Alistair, waiting for him to tell her to retreat, to hide, to pretend compliance. Instead, he stepped forward, moving with the calm force of inevitability. "Bring them to me," he said, voice low and resonant, yet carrying over every corner of the room without effort. Eleanor's pulse quickened. This was no longer protection from shadows or rumor. This was a declaration, an irrevocable confrontation. When the socialites arrived, expecting to find a woman trembling under scrutiny, they found instead Alistair Ravenswood standing beside Eleanor, arms folded, eyes dark with quiet fury. The air itself seemed to tighten around him, an invisible current that demanded attention, respect, obedience. "My wife's honor is not yours to dissect," he said, voice cutting through the room like a sharpened blade. "Nor will any of you presume to dictate her worth, her conduct, or her choice of attachment." A gasp echoed, a few murmurs faltering as his presence, his conviction, silenced their assault. Eleanor's chest swelled with disbelief and a fragile sense of triumph. She had feared the scrutiny of society, but she had underestimated the man who had been labeled a monster, the man who could wield silence and protection with such terrifying elegance. Eleanor stepped closer to him, feeling the warmth radiating from his body despite the storm outside. His hand found hers briefly, reassuring, grounding, as if both understood that no words were necessary to convey trust and unity. The room remained rigid with astonishment, the socialites retreating into a careful diplomacy that Eleanor had never imagined she could command simply by standing beside him. For a moment, the storm outside and the storm within her chest seemed aligned, chaotic yet electrifying. Hours later, the storm subsided to a steady drizzle, and the manor settled into a fragile quiet. Eleanor followed Alistair to his study, a room lined with books and relics, the scent of cedar and old parchment grounding her senses. She felt exhaustion press against her shoulders, the culmination of tension, fear, and anticipation leaving her vulnerable in a way she had never allowed. "I thought," she began, voice trembling, "that even you might turn against me." He shook his head, expression unreadable yet softened by something rare, something tender. "I am not what they claim me to be," he murmured. "I am flawed, yes. Scarred, yes. Guarded, yes. But my loyalty, Eleanor, and my intent toward you, are neither rumor nor shadow. They are absolute." He stepped closer, and for the first time, the distance between them dissolved, leaving only the quiet thrum of shared understanding. Her hand found his chest again, over the steady beat of a heart that had endured solitude, judgment, and relentless expectation. She felt the strength beneath his words, the undeniable protection and intensity, and allowed herself a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Then I do not fear you," she said softly, voice breaking with emotion. "I only fear losing you." The faintest curve of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips, shadowed by solemnity but luminous with something she could not yet name. He reached for her, gently cupping her face, a gesture that spoke of restraint, reverence, and a long-suppressed desire. "Then you shall not," he whispered, voice husky, tempered by emotion he seldom allowed himself to reveal. "Not while I breathe, not while I stand. I will guard you from the world, Eleanor, as fiercely as I guard my own heart." Her eyes blurred with tears, not of shame, not of fear, but of release. The man they called a monster, the man they had feared, was revealed in this moment as both her protector and her mirror, reflecting the strength and vulnerability she had barely acknowledged within herself. She leaned into his hand instinctively, a silent surrender that was not weakness but trust, the first in a long series of confessions neither would voice aloud for fear of shattering its fragile perfection. The storm outside had quieted entirely, leaving only a gentle patter against the windows, a lullaby of renewal. Eleanor rested her forehead against his shoulder, inhaling the scent of cedar and smoke, feeling the steady warmth of a body that would no longer let her falter alone. For the first time since her engagement, she realized that fear and expectation could be transformed into something fierce, protective, and tender. She felt the truth of the man before her. His scars were real, his distance justified by experience, and his devotion utterly unwavering. Then, As the night settled around them and the manor exhaled its long-held breath, Alistair lowered his forehead to hers, voice barely more than a whisper. "If I am a monster, Eleanor," he said, "it is only for those who would harm you. For you, I am neither myth nor terror. I am yours." The word struck her with the force of revelation and relief, a culmination of fear, longing, and hope entwined in a single fragile confession. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a full surrender to the emotion, knowing that the rumors, the societal scrutiny, and the whispered judgments would never again have dominion over her heart. The world could call him a monster, could twist his legend, but here, in this sanctuary of shared understanding, he was neither legend nor rumor. He was the man who had saved her from despair, from loneliness, from fear. And in his arms, she found a strength she had never imagined she could possess. Yet even as she exhaled, a single flicker of doubt remained, subtle and insistent. Outside, the last trace of the storm brushed the garden, leaving shadows on the snow, shadows that whispered of trials yet unseen. Eleanor felt it, a quiet thrill of anticipation, knowing that while this night had revealed the heart of the monster, the world beyond the walls of Ravenswood Manor still demanded its reckoning. And in that unspoken tension, the promise of their shared future trembled, fragile, dangerous, and incandescent.